Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff. We're very glad to welcome back to the program Kamau Franklin, who is the founder of Community Movement Builders, Inc., and has been a dedicated community organizer for over 30 years, starting in New York City and now based in Atlanta. For 18 of those years, Kamau was a leading member of a national grassroots organization dedicated to the ideas of self-determination and the teachings of Malcolm X. Kamau has coordinated and led community cop watch programs, liberation freedom schools for youth, electoral and policy campaigns, large-scale community gardens, organizing collectives, and alternatives to incarceration programs. He was also an attorney for 10 years in New York with his own practice in criminal, civil rights, and transactional law. Kamau, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. And I kind of want to start with, how are things? I imagine that you more so than me have been inundated with people calling or texting or reaching out saying that they're scared or they're not sure what's happened and what to do. And I also kind of assume that, like me, you felt in early November neither surprised by election results nor that they represented anything specifically un-American or otherwise aberrant to the norm. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about these very legitimate feelings of fear in the context of your experience and understanding of the U.S. project.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're experiencing in terms of what's happening right now in the United States is sort of a time period in history that's repeating itself. Not exactly, of course, but I think a lot of what's happening is stuff that we can look back in the past around how when overt white nationalism comes to power, how it projects itself, how it acts. So I think Trump is a manifestation of a lot of things that we've seen before. I just think this is a new period of time in which folks have not been used to it, right? I think we've been used to a little bit more of either so-called compassionate conservatism, where the overt white racism is not there. And I think we've been used to neoliberal democratic parties that claim to be including everybody as they continue to fight for empire and for capitalist interests around the world and domestically. And so I do think there are some particular ways in which this white nationalist regime is working, which I do think are scary for people and should be acknowledged. And they're not the same operating mechanisms that neoliberal fascist Democrats operate under, right? And so I do think that's a scary time for the domestic population in particular. And I see that happening, obviously, with the ways in which the workforce is being disorientated in terms of the federal workforce, mass firings and layoffs. You see that in a way that the positioning of DEI is operating as a code word for to be polite for the audience, Black people. Getting too much, having too much, and need to be put back in terms of a racial hierarchy. And so so I think it's also an interesting time for somebody like me in terms of politics, because I think there are some things about this white nationalist movement which are challenging the capitalist order, not because it's opposed to capitalism, but because it wants that order to work for the benefit of working class whites, as it suggested did more in the 50s and 60s, which means more jobs for working class whites, reindustrialization, bringing companies home, decent paychecks. But there's a hierarchy to that, right? And that has to do with who gets it, who's undeserving, i.e. the overt attack again on immigrants and the removing of people in vile and distasteful ways. So I think that is something that is interesting in terms of how that's happening, right? But nonetheless distressing in terms of the general public. Again, immigrants, Black folks, women, I think all of these different communities, LGBTQ community is under a particular type of attack, which is more overt, but again, which has always been there, but something that we have to sort of battle and fight through.
Yeah, and I wanna kind of dig into that a little bit more because our media system, I mean, of course, there is like the outright fascist and extreme right wing media, but predominantly the corporate media is neoliberal, and it is it is you know pearl clutching about, oh my gosh, they're destroying our democracy. But of course, in order to destroy it, you'd have to have one in the first place. And I was wondering, how would you suggest parsing the manufactured fear, like that liberal America is pushing, against the legitimate fear that you've just discussed?
Mhm. I think it's a hard time to do so because I think people, as you said, I think the neoliberal media, what it does is push people into a space of, you know what the solution is to bring back the Democrats, right? So that's what their solution is. And unless a real left really, through other mechanisms and means, whether or not those are podcasts, social media, radio, obviously in your face ground, on the ground organizing, is able to capture enough people so that they don't look towards this neoliberal media as a source of information, then I think we're still going to be in some real trouble in terms of persuading the public, right? So I think that is the fight is still for the hearts and minds of the public. If some of us work on different sections of the public, let's say, but I do think that there's something that we have to overcome. The neoliberal establishment media is going to continually push us into another 2 year to 4 year cycle of, you know what the solution is? In 2 years, let's have the Democrats control the House or the Democrats control the Senate. And then in 4 years, who's going to be the brand new shining bright object that supposedly is going to be so different from Trump? But as we've already seen in this time period, even the response by the Democrats has been to not push back fully on the fascist agenda, right? But to do what they do always, which is to say, oh, there might be some, we want diversity, but come on, we know there's been a lot of too much of this DEI thing also. There's been no fight back around affirmative action. It's not obviously on the Palestine Israel issue. It was the Democrats who enacted the genocide and continued to defend Israel and its genocide. So the differences for people are really a sense of calmness that they get out of their everyday lives, that folks are sort of propagandized to want back. So I think we as a left have to do more to distinguish ourselves from the Democratic alternative. I think there were some attempts this time, but I do think a lot of those attempts ended in failure in terms of pushing people left behind Kamala Harris type or whomever the new Democratic candidate will be. But again, I just think that's an ongoing struggle to point out that the Democrats are not an alternative to the Republicans, because for the most part, they're going to allow most of these policies to stay in effect. They'll take off the things that are the rougher edges. They get people really upset. But they won't hire back the full workforce once the Republicans slash and burn at the federal level. They won't stop again with empire building. And they won't do anything to reshape the economy to take most of the control out of the hands of the rich and powerful, right? So I think this is going to be a real battle over the next 2 to 4 years for a strong left to come into place and figure out what are the ways in which we organize and work to convince people that the Democrats are not the alternative, that we need to be out not only in the streets now, but in the streets in 2 years, not at the election booth as the only alternative to the fight that we have at hand.
Yeah, and I do want to get into that specific question in a minute. But before we get there, I do want to also ask you. Um, I want to talk about another emotion as opposed to fear, that is one that is both uplifted in the U.S. but also condemned. So, for instance, when it's white anger towards the perceived threats against white supremacy or capitalism, i.e., DEI, immigrants, what have you. Um, versus the very legitimate anger against the system or against genocide, against white supremacy, or against capitalism. And this anger is always condemned and portrayed as savage and unwarranted. And a lot of this has to do with like the politics of civility, right? You know, you should ask nicely and da 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 da. The well-meaning liberal, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. put it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way that that specific emotion of anger is portrayed as in these two disparate ways, and how to kind of accept anger as a legitimate emotion and what to do with it in these times.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're completely correct. When we look at the Tea Party, for instance, the anger of the white males in claiming that they deserve or want their country back. Again, there's a large segment of the white population, a segment of the American population. In fact, I would say in some places, the majority white population slash American population, which totally legitimizes any act of so-called anger by these white populations and white masses. And so, i.e., the January 6th attack on the Capitol, many of us were sort of sitting back on the left and be like, well, this is interesting, right? From a standpoint of there's a large segment of society which looks at that as a legitimate force in action, right? I.e., the Boston Tea Party. And so white anger, white angst, white militant action always gets approval from a certain, and again, sometimes not just a critical mass, but a majority population as a part of the body politic, not only domestically speaking, like organized white anger. And again, we can go back historically and look at lynchings, look at white riots in Black communities, that how these things, again, we live in a country that at one point you could actually have postcards of lynching and sell those in general stores for people to send to family members. So white mobs and white violence that is connected, usually, obviously, to law enforcement, whether independent, overtly independent, or secretly connected to it, has always been something that's been justified. And obviously, going further, white action and or military action overseas is always justified. There's never been a time where either neoliberal and or conservatives have not seen a war that they did not like, that it wasn't justified for America to act, right? What we'll get sometimes is there was an overextension, there were casualties, collateral damage, but always done under the guise of this was something that was meant to be good for America or was on the right path, but there were excesses, and those excesses have to be understood and corrected. But the policy was never wrong, right? The intent was never wrong. There's always a goodness which is shown for that. So the use of violence by America to further its aims and goals and objectives, both domestically and internationally, has always been accepted. And on the other hand, of course, what has never been accepted is left-wing militant action and or any Black action that derives itself or places itself out of a sense of anger at the oppression that Black people have faced, right? Any action by Black people that has been taken as militant action is an action which either A, through law enforcement and or through propaganda and media, is always wrong. It's always going too far. It's always looked upon as there is another way. And aren't we all Americans when Black people pick up guns, when Black people take militant action, when we're not on our knees at sit-ins and so forth. So I think this is part of the American propaganda system, which basically says that you have no right to take up arms against those who oppress you unless you are white, right? Or unless you are doing it on behalf of the government system. So the control, the use of tools of violence, is very much statecraft, right? In terms of who gets to wield it, when it gets to be wielded, and for whose benefit. But I've always been one of those, since I've become an organizer, someone who believes in militant action. We have a right to defend ourselves. Left action justly has a right to fight back against fascism, against white supremacy, against white nationalism. And again, part of the role of the left is to try to make that more of a type of politics or a type of action which people understand and in which people actually side with. And one great example of this, which is not necessarily a left action, but if you look at the killing of the CEO, right? It's again, it has some weird connotations to it. In terms of, I don't think if a Black person did it, if a Latino person did it, that it would have been sort of celebrated in the sense that it was. So that's just one remark I think is important to make. But the idea that this action, in terms of what people are suffering from, was something that some people actually stood up and said, you know, I may have some problems with some of that, but let's face it, these CEOs in these companies have been causing the deaths of people in the hundreds of thousands every year through their policies and actions. And you'll get the refrain that somebody had to stand up and stood up, right? So there's got to be ways in which we project left militant action. I'm not going to openly say that we should be shooting CEOs, but we have to present left militant action as a way in which we counter the type of right-wing action and government murdering and killing of our people. That this type of action is the only action at times which pushes back against the violence that's against our communities. When you look at the Deacons for Defense, when you look at the Black Panther Party, when you look at the BLA, it has only been some of these actions that have pushed back the violence against our communities. And so, yeah, I think it's a propaganda too that the government, that state agencies, and again, that the white populists keep control of, i.e., the use of violence, but there has to be breakthroughs around who gets to be angry, who gets to protect their communities from violence, which is ongoingly pressed against us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to, with that, I kind of want to ask you about, because this is something that I've seen in organizing spaces as well, as the sort of romanticization of violence, typically from white organizers, sort of, this wanting to cosplay as Shay and Fidel or something like that, and not really making it seem more like a Hollywood film than really understanding that violence is a tool and a tactic and not something that we should engage in this kind of like flippant and romanticized way. How would you how would you say that it's a good how can we look at this as kind of in a sober way without falling into that Hollywoodization of violence?
Yeah, I think when we look at it, I mean, well, the left is weak. The left is in no position to take forward revolutionary violent action against the state of America. I mean, we can't even take on, they don't have to call out the National Guard. One precinct, like two squad cars would do the damage necessary to stop any action. So it's at this particular point in time, it is not a strategic tactical maneuver to call for mass violence in the streets when the left is in no position to even carry that out, right? And I think you're right. People get into the kind of the dreamscape of thinking that we're in this revolutionary situation where at this particular moment we're not. But we are in a position of militant action. And I think when we look at to bring forth like some of the tactics and strategies that were used in mass in the Cop City actions, we're taking action against property, and justifying that action because again, that this property damage stopped a forest from being cut down, or it was in terms of the Palestinian massacre that was taking place by the United States through and folks taking action against these industries, these armed image industries that are making the arms that are being sent to Israel. So surrounding offices, smashing windows at offices. Again, there are consequences for these actions, but I think these actions are real actions that militant organizing should have at its disposal, in terms of organizing against, again, an oppressive system that will use all means and mechanisms to destroy not any opposition to it, right? And that is propaganda, that is through the use of violence and everything else in between that. So I do think there are places for militant action to take place, but those things have to be countered in terms of the dangers involved, how they're done. I think again, I appreciate some of the actions of particularly anarchist organizations that understand the idea of actions taking place in different cells or away from mass actions that are taking place at times. And again, I think sometimes we get foolhardy in terms of thinking, oh, we can do this and do that. And then there's going to be consequences to those. But again, I'm not somebody who says you take that out the tool belt. Those things have to be considered. Those things have to be weighed. They have to be thought through, but there has to be an understanding that the state will attack, that the state will not just rest on its laurels, and we're not in a position for a full frontal organizing campaign that is based in violence, right? We're just not there. But we are in a position to try to defend ourselves. We are in a position to suggest and to do work that is militant in action, that is not just going to a rally and a demonstration when we're told to show up. That's not just walking on the sidewalks, that's not just making speeches and leaving when we're told to leave, right? Those ideas are a little played out in terms of the opposition even considering those mass actions, which they have to be in fear of, right? So I do think there's other things that we need to be thinking about, thinking through, being more militant, doing more base building in communities. So it's not just the activists and organizers who are taking these leading roles, but it is community that is taking on these leading roles. And lastly, I'll say, like, there's a lot of actions that are frontal actions around rebellions that take place without being led by organizations. And those rebellions and rebellious activities are things that we need to endorse and to say we have to understand, as Dr. King would say, why the masses would take these actions when you make so-called peaceful resolution, as I think as Kennedy said once, possible, you make violent revolution inevitable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very well put. And speaking of quoting brilliant folks from the past, Huey P. Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, once said, "I dissuade party members from putting down people who do not understand. You can't win people over by drawing the line of demarcation, saying you are on this side and I am on the other. That shows a lack of consciousness." After the Black Panther Party was formed, I nearly fell into this error. I could not understand why people were blind to what I saw so clearly. Then I realized that their understanding had to be developed, end quote. I felt that quote a lot. And I think what we're seeing right now, there's so much ripping along party lines, of falling into these chasms that are really made for us by the ruling class. And I'm curious, where do you see these pathways to build, understanding that, like you said, it shouldn't just be activists who are doing all of this or organizers that are doing all this work. It's communities, and community organizing means that you have to be connecting with people who you don't agree on with everything. So where do you see those pathways, and where do you feel that there is, if there is, a solid line of demarcation saying, no, I won't work with these people?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think at some point it becomes a solid line of demarcation, but I do think that's after several attempts to bring people over. And, the very nature of organizing is that you're trying to win people over, right? You're trying to win over their so-called hearts and minds. You're trying to convince them of something that maybe they haven't considered in its full context, and or to take action that they would not take even if they believe the same thing that you believe, right? I think there's a lot of room for argument and debate and discussion on these things, and room for people to have different ideas and to not just like take them out of your organizational atmosphere or your organizational work, because some of the ideas are different. Even when some of the ideas are dangerous, to be honest with you, even when some of the ideas are anti what a lot of us stand for, if we as organizers cannot convince people to organize despite their sort of limitations because they haven't read what you've read or studied what you've studied, then again, we failed, right? Because the idea of mass organizing is that you're going to bring people to a place where they're going to begin to start to change their attitudes. But if you just shut them down or shut them off, then you've like not even given them a chance to grow or change, right? So I do think that part of mass organizing is working with people who have some different views, different thoughts, different ideas, things that you may find, I don't want to say boring, but things that you disagree with, right? But I do think after a while, like there is a line of demarcation. There are lines where people show themselves not to want to change. Then you have to protect those who are already organizing with you. You cannot allow people to be abused. You can't allow people to have violence acted upon them. You can't allow people to verbally be put down over and over again in ways which are violent or make people put people in fear of who they are in terms of their identities. I do think all of that begins to matter, and I think organizations and organizers and activists have to figure out sort of strategies, and I think we're all terrible at it, to be honest, but strategies in which we understand where people at and how we bring them towards organizing. And then on the other side of it, we have to make sure that, there's a lot of denunciation that's taken place in movement circles over the last 6, 7, 8 years. And some of that denunciation may be justified, but a lot of it seems to be also power grabbing, to be honest. It also seems to be a way in which those who feel like they haven't had power before now get to exercise some power. And sometimes that's done without facts or without investigation, but just through name calling and pointing. So I think sometimes because the left at its base is a place where people can just come in from any sort of level or where they haven't don't have a lot of experience organizing, but it's a place where they can exert some sort of power. And then we become liberals, right? We don't stand up and say like, we have to have ways in which we settle these disputes through a mechanism and process. And it's not just, if as several of us points again, it all counts on what the conditions are, what the issues are, and so forth. But we can't just in general point and say this one's out, that one's out, this one's out, right? So I do think the left is terrible at this in terms of its overall base building strategies and how to organize. I think over the last several years, the left has done a lot to rip itself apart. And I think the left has also been infected. This is beyond what you're asking, but I think the left has also been infected by sort of this nonprofitization of how we do our work, the massive amount of resources that has sort of pulled apart a liberal left and I would say a more militant left around the role of electoral politics in any sort of strategy. I think those things are purposeful. I think even the idea of some of these foundations who have thrown money on the table and they don't even tell you what to do with the money. They don't even tell you what you can't do with the money. But the mere fact that we are unable to work through how to spend the money and everyone thinks they have the best ideas and or who deserves this. People are coming to the left not as a movement, not as an ideological persuasion or positioning, but because they think it's a place to get your finances up, right? They think it's a place to get a good job. They think it's a place to get more resources, and it speaks to the larger conditions of our communities that are suffering, that do need resources. But we've not been ready for it. We've not built the base of operation that really challenges, again, not only the hard right conservatives, but the neoliberal, democratic sponsored so-called left that sees itself tied to the Democratic Party as opposed to breaking off, that has as much knowledge as you do, you and I do, on sort of the oratory on who the Democrats are, their role in empire, but somehow have not been able to break away from the cycle of electoral politics every 2 to 4 years, or offering an alternative to the Democratic Party that they're putting real resources in that says, you know what, we're going to build a third party, or we build if we do have these people in the party that are going to fight through this party, then they have to have these politics, and otherwise we're not going to support them. Whatever your line of struggle is on that, but we've not successfully created a line of struggle that really puts us in a different position than what the Democratic Party offers us. And so, for the left, in some ways, the Democratic Party is a bigger hindrance to our organizing than the right wing Republicans, because we already know overtly what they do, how they operate, and how they act, and how they are overtly again against the interests of our people. We've been sucked into this vortex of believing that we can make the Democrats more left, or we can pull them here, or we can do things to make them think certain ways. And I think that has been a bigger issue for the left than sort of fighting the Republicans.
Absolutely. I mean, I oftentimes tell people who ask why I don't complain about the Republicans as much. I'm like, because it's very clear who they are, but the Democrats act like they want to help you, and they paint Black Lives Matter on the street, and they wrap themselves in a rainbow flag, and they say that they care, and then they stab you in the back. And to me, that's more insidious than somebody just punching you in the face.
Mhm.
So I that's typically why I fetch more about the Republicans. Um, but I also wanna I wanna talk a little bit about solutions as well, because this is something that I also feel is oftentimes lacking in some organizing spaces. Is it sometimes can turn into this like, "Hey, let's just gather around and complain," and legitimate complaints, but there's this other piece that's missing that oftentimes leads to people feeling burnt out, like, "Well, I've just been, struggling and fighting against all of this, but what am I fighting for? What am I building?" And, part of this is also media. We at Project Censored talk a lot about the issues with corporate media never covering solutions journalism. But I want to talk to you about something. Well, this is just a recent project, or a more recent project that I've seen that you've been engaged with, the Love, Land, and Liberation Project. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about this and how this fits into the category of solutions, and not only in a broad sense, but also in the sense that bringing people together to do something that isn't just sitting around and complaining?
hmm I mean, I think we as community movement builders, and I think Kali Akuno from Cooperation to Action should take a lot of credit for this sort of a build and fight strategy, right? So part of that strategy is, and if we look at the history, particularly of Black organizing, the organizations that have been able to capture the imagination of a Black populace have been those organizations that have been able to build institutions in the Black community that the community controls. And that's everything from the UNIA, that's the United Negro Improvement Association, Marcus Garvey, to the Panthers, to at times the Nation of Islam with Malcolm, to SNCC. When you look at some of these organizations, SNCC in terms of its freedom schools and even some of his electoral work, but SNCC dug deep into the Black community. Like members actually moved to certain communities and started to build out freedom schools and taught people Marxism, communism, right? They studied it with ordinary, everyday people. You look at the Panthers and the breakfast clubs and the schools, and again, part of the study was heavy hitting stuff to reach people who ordinarily would not come to those kind of settings. But if you provide breakfast in a setting that was comfortable for them, then people were ready and willing to learn and listen, right? When you look at the nation, and even if I'm anti-capitalist, but I believe that cooperatives don't offer a solution, but they offer alternative models of what development can look like. And if we present those alternative models of what development can look like, and that's part of what our Love Land and Liberation Project is, which is basically a farm that we purchased that's about 13 and a half acres, that we already have animals on. We're already distributing food from the farm to the community. We're building out cooperatives that are going to be stationed at the farm. It's going to be a retreat center for gatherings, for folks on the left to have spaces where we can organize and meet at. So we can build out some of these institutions that, again, can be challenged by the state. But when we build these institutions, we are more likely to want to defend these institutions. When we build some organizational apparatus, we're more likely to have spaces where we can defend and we can fight for, and we can show the larger population that the left isn't just about complaining, or just isn't about talking, or just isn't about having rallies and demonstrations, but there's actually on the ground field work that you can get involved in day to day, getting your hands dirty, as we say. That's really important for struggle. It's really important for people to see what the alternatives look like. And so when we talk about things like liberated territory or autonomous space, at its heart, it's saying like, what could we create that are models that folks can look at and see and participate in, that gives them sort of the strength to say that this capitalist infrastructure that we're all swimming in is not the only thing that we can build. It's not the only way that life can be organized around. And I think that's also one of the biggest challenges for the left, is to build out what those alternatives look like in a way that in somewhat can scale, can involve everyday people, and that can bring some resources to people in their lives, and so that they can see what those alternatives again look like. So I think that's at its heart, that's what the Love and Land Liberation Project is about. And when we talk about build and fight, that build part is so extremely important because we have not captured people on a day-to-day level, right? There will be uprisings that have happened in the recent past, that are usually things that have been done to us, impacts of things that have been done to us, whether larger economic things or police killings. But those things have not sustained movement, right? They've come and they've gone. What is it that we do to build out these organizational structures, these collective structures that make people join and want to continually work on these and build them out, so that they're bigger and reach more people, so that again we can show what alternative interventions look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that too, because as somebody who's done mutual aid organizing in the past, like, when you meet up in a community garden or something, no, you don't ask anybody who walks in like, "Hey, what have you read by Emma Goldman?" Like that's not it does you just kind of
hmm
you interact like human beings. And of course there's that political education aspect, but it's not a barrier. It's not a gatekeeping to engaging with folks. And before we end here, we have a few minutes left. I want to kind of circle back to something that you were talking about, and when you were talking about the getting removing ourselves from these electoral cycles, I was remembering that when the election was called for Biden in 2020, I was on my way to meet up with a comrade who we were doing mutual aid with, and 95% of DC like votes Democrats, and the place was just uproarious. People were clapping and yelling out their windows, and I meant to, I meant to meet up with my comrade, and they were like, "This is so disgusting." And we just kind of stood and listened to people cheering and and they said, because they're an organizer who does a lot of organizing east of the river in DC, which is predominantly Black and works with Black Lives Matter, and said a bunch of white folks are going to go to brunch now. And which was true. A lot of we lost a lot of people in the weekly, mutual aid meetups and things like that. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what would you say to folks who are organizing this time around to make sure that people don't go to brunch? Like, what is that piece missing, that where people are still getting drawn into this? Oh, in 4 years it's going to be okay if we get a Democrat. Like, what do we need to be doing as organizers to try and keep people in these spaces?
Well, I think it's a little bit about what we talked about earlier. Is the one we have to, and some of this are is like building out bigger media projects, right? Some of this is about us being able to put out propaganda which shows people information that shows people the distinction between a left and the commonalities between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And that going back to the status quo is just not good enough, right? It is under the status quo again where a genocide took place. It is under the status quo where the idea of defunding the police went to die, and instead you had Biden shouting not defund but refund and fund the police, and you had a standing ovation from the Democratic side of the aisle. It is under that Democratic initiative that we even had these crime bills that developed that in call blew up mass incarceration at the federal level and in a larger at a larger way at the state level. So I think all of this stuff are things at which we have to convince people that going back to normal, what they consider normal, is not a victory, right? Because once those Democrats get back in, again, as we spoke about earlier, they're not going to bring back the full workforce of the federal government. They're not going to bring back affirmative action. They're not going to bring back industrialized jobs and so forth. None of that's going to happen under the Democrats. They're not going to move in a way that's anti-capitalist or challenging the oligarchs or whatever. Unless we build alternative electoral functioning institutions also, and or strong candidates who speak really for the left. And I'm not talking about a Bernie Sanders type, actually, something that's really left, right? We have to figure out how do we build those things. I think it's both there's some electoral projects and there's some media projects that have to get bigger, that we have to figure out how to grow, so that we don't let people fall into the same trap. And a lot of this is base building on the ground also. And so all of those projects that we spoke about, how are we capturing people in their neighborhoods, in their communities, at their work sites? How are we getting involved with people on a day-to-day basis so that we're having these discussions, and these discussions are getting bigger? We're creating ways and methods in which we can duplicate in other places. What are ways in which we're showing success in one place that can be duplicated in other places? How are these conversations happening? How are people being moved, right? Unless we as a left begin to figure that out and to begin implementing the things that we figure out, we're going to be stuck in this place because, again, the Democrats are part of empire. The Democrats have literally billions of dollars at their disposal, just as the Republicans do. And their job is to be a part of the ruling class, not to break away from the ruling class. And so we have to make sure that people understand that. And we have to do that work, that on the ground, hard, difficult work that does burn people out, unfortunately. But we have to figure out how do we do that and how we do it in a way that can be duplicated all across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big portion of that is going back to what you talked about, the collaborating and not seeing ourselves in these silos, like Cornell West and Jill Stein and then PSL, we're all running at the same time. And I'm like, for why? Just what are we doing here? And then the socialists are yelling at the anarchists, and the anarchists are yelling at and I'm like, guys, we are arguing about imagined issues, And meanwhile, we're dying. We're
Yes.
dying of curable diseases. We're dying of police violence. Like, this is not important whether trash pickup happens under a social, like, stop. So ridiculous. And this sort of, like you were talking about, the left is tearing itself apart and
Mhm.
doing the work of empire as opposed to finding ways to build bridges as opposed to burn them under the guise of, well, this is my specific leftist flag. So
Really quickly, I mean, because I completely agree with you. Like I've been involved or seen so many discussions and fights that just seem we haven't won one thing. We haven't captured anything for you to be arguing over who had the correct line, Mao versus Lenin versus this one versus that one, anarchists versus socialists, as you said. But yet it feels to me, part of it is that we feel so powerless that we turn our insight on each other as opposed to, like you said, like, you know what? We can, if we're reaching a point where we're about to take over the means of production, God knows, let's have that fight. You know what I mean? Then that's rip each other apart and have that fight. But we're not anywhere close to that, to whereas we need to be separating, dividing ourselves and writing these statements against this one's ideological position and that ideological position as if it matters to anybody outside of the small circle of groups that you're already in. So I do think it's a sort of like, circular firing squad that we continue to be involved in that does us damage and allows others to continue going forth and on their merry way and again capturing resources and people, or at the very least making sure that people aren't active in challenging them and making people consumers and so forth. So yeah, we on the left have a lot of work to do to break out of that cycle, whereas again, it's not that we can't have principled discussions, but at the end of the day, after those discussions have had, what is the common work that we're doing together to keep pushing this organizing? So
absolutely. Thank you, Kamau. Your insight is always like a breath of fresh air and a bit of a stale a stale existence. Kamau, where's a good place for people to follow your work?
I'm on all the social medias so far. Blue Sky, which I hope to go to, and as opposed to X, but I'm still on X. The organization itself, communitymovementbuilders.org, is the website. We're also on all the social medias, so folks can go there and check us out and see the work that we're trying to do.
Thank you so much, Kamau. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it also.
Right. Right.